would like to add, most of you know him, of course, but he was the government's crisis man when UTI had to be rescued, then IDBI. Following that, of course, he was chairman of SEBI. During his time, there were many momentous, decisions that were taken. And after that, he's had a career as a director in the board of some of the bluest of blue chip companies in India. And of course, he's founder of Excellence Enablers. He's a corporate governance champion now. And dare I say, a writer of trenchant newsletters. So, Mr. Damodaran, I'd like to take off from where Mr. Narayan just left, where he was talking about, retaining the trust of investors. Now, over the last 3 years, we have seen demat accounts have surged, and now, almost a fifth of the nation, in terms of retail investors, a number of people, they are all participating in the stock market. Now, if you were to advise, the current SEBI dispensation, and indeed Mr. Narayan, what do you think they should do to ensure that the trust of the fifth of the country's public is intact?
It would be a very brave person who would advise Anant on these matters. And over the last 20-25 minutes, I think there was adequate evidence adduced why you can't advise somebody who's so much on top of his game. The markets have grown in complexity, in size. Number of investors have increased, and I think he laid out all of that. Number of issuers have increased, and therefore the supply is also improved. Complexities exist. There are external factors not related to India, but impacting on the Indian markets. All of that is happening. If you rewind to maybe a decade plus, many of these complexities did not exist. I think, and I say this as a former SEBI official, SEBI is not getting credit for the kind of work that it's doing. If they get 9 things right out of 10, it's only the 10th that gets focused. The 9, I think that business about, the good being interred and the evil living after them, that phenomenon. Or to give another example, that when dog bites man, it's not news. When man bites dog, it's news. So you pick out that one example and do that. I think they're doing a very good job. They don't need advice. What they need is, and I say this with some amount of trepidation, but I will say it nevertheless, the advantage of being much older than everyone else in this room is that I can speak without a mental filter. And I say this with some trepidation. In the excitement to do more good things, somewhere I think regulatory impact assessment should get factored into the decision-making process. That's all that I wish to say. He rightly identified trust as important, because I think we have moved to trust but verify. I had said many years ago that we need to make that move from distrust and crucify to trust but verify. And I think that has been done.
So how do you suggest that we go about this regulatory impact assessment? How can, regulators, because not just SEBI, but even with other regulators, especially now when we have technology and a lot of innovation happening, how should regulatory officials thread the needle between not, being excessively zealous, but at the same time, ensuring that there is protection of investors and consumers?
I think one is doing the right things. The other is telling a disbelieving audience, at least one that has been disbelieving for several years, that you are doing the right things. Perception is as important as reality. And I think you can't expect a regulator, and I've said this times without number, what is SEBI doing in such and such case? I said SEBI does not come onto the streets and regulate in full public view. There must be something happening there that you and I don't know about. Because it's not that they are not seized of the problems, they're not seized of the issues that arise in the marketplace, they're acting on it, but they're not going to come out on the road and explain on a day-by-day basis. They don't have spokesmen of the kind that central investigative agencies have, that on a daily basis you explain what is happening. That's not SEBI's job. I would be disappointed if SEBI did anything that kind. I believe what SEBI needs to do more of is a very calibrated communication package that does not seem to be advertising its own work and at the same time getting the message across, look, your interests are safe with us, we know what your issues are, and we're looking at it.
So you're saying, like justice, like SEBI, the wheels of SEBI also grind slowly, but they grind fine.
I don't say they grind slowly, they don't grind visibly. When they finally grind and the final order comes out, then you realize what they have done. But that order is the product of a lot of work, of a lot of, let's say, investigation going on, surveillance, for example, and that translates to the enforcement action. So you won't see it happening. The process is not visible, and thank God for that.
You have been a champion of corporate governance. I would like to ask you this: when you look at what's going on in some companies, I'll take names here, Dish TV, Z, Religare, etc. We wonder as observers, whether the shareholders are the company's real owners. They are unable to hold AGMs and EGMs. It appears that the majority of non-promoter shareholders, want the company to be run by a new promoter. However, the incumbent promoter is not keen to move away. These companies were also the subject of your recent newsletter.
Yes.
So what I want to ask is, what more can regulatory bodies do, eyes of shareholders being the real owners of companies, that is actually enforced?
I think we shouldn't look at regulators to do this job. If somebody has actually invested his or her money in a company, the primary responsibility of ensuring that that money is put to good use is that of the shareholder. Now you are saying AGMs did not take place. It's true, AGMs did not take place. Accounts were not finalized. Auditors resigned in a few cases. All of this happened. Luckily, these are the exceptions, but these are the ones that get spoken about. There are several thousand companies where work goes on in a monotonous fashion. All these boxes get ticked. Now, what should shareholders do? Shareholders should demand of the board of directors that, look, you guys are sitting there in a representative capacity. Tell us what you are doing to protect our interest. They don't have to go to the regulator for that. Yes, if the board is not doing anything at all, bring it to the notice of the regulator. But today you are seeing more evidence, and that's a happy sign, of directors individually and boards as a collective standing up to the promoters and say, we will not have any of this. If they are unable to get any change in the boardroom, then they put in the papers and leave. And SEBI has rightly mandated that when you leave the board, tell us why you're leaving. Don't say you're leaving for personal reasons. Even then, some people write personal reasons. I know one director who, on the verge of leaving, she had been threatened by the promoters that if you continue opposing our proposals, you could come to grief. And so, in fear more than anything else, she put in her papers. But she spoke to me 2 days before that. Somebody had known for years. I said, why didn't you write all of this in your resignation letter? I'm not for a moment suggesting you stay in the board and fight, because clearly you're one against several, and you've noticed that it doesn't work. So there's more effect in your leaving the board, but leaving it in a manner which tells the whole world why you left it. But she still wrote personal reasons, and when I asked her, why did you write personal reasons? She said, my life and liberty are personal reasons. So therefore, I couldn't push it beyond a point. Yes, they are personal reasons, right? But directors are pushing back. That's the good news.
But from your experience, you yourself have been an independent director and was interacting with companies and such people. How difficult is it to stand up to promoters of a company, as an independent.
Okay, I don't know whether disappoint is the right word, but let me disappoint you by what I'm about to say. I've had far less problem with promoter directors than with so-called professional directors. People who were appointed to senior positions, they reached those positions, believed that they owned the place, they owned the company, and nobody else counted. And I don't want to take names, but if you look at some of the large companies where you had this larger-than-life chairpersons or managing directors, you get what I'm saying. Promoters are a bunch of misunderstood people. There are bad elements. I'm not for a moment saying they're all good elements. But I have come across promoters of large companies who actually reach out to the directors, and I'm not talking even about today's promoters. I'll take a name. Brij Mohan Lal Munjal, no longer with us, who died in his 90s. I had the privilege of serving on his board. He would not clear a proposal on the board if the management brought it unless he looked around, saw whether the other directors, the independents, were happy, and he occasionally reached out to some of us. What do you think about this proposal? And you had the freedom to argue against it. It didn't matter that his son was the managing director. It didn't matter. So there was freedom there, but I've seen, I want to distinguish between professional-led companies and professionally-led companies. These are not the same thing. There is a difference.
So in general, would you say that corporate governance level in Indian companies have improved with more active participation by independent directors?
Yes, I think directors are pushing back when they see something wrong. And I think management and the controlling shareholder, except one controlling shareholder, which is the government of India, controlling shareholders understand that there could be embarrassment if one or two directors actually said, sorry, we don't want any part of this, and leave. As for the government of India, I've always maintained that having enacted the provisions in law, they are among the biggest violators of the provisions that they themselves, and I can give you hundreds of examples, don't want to delay you here.
Over the years, many people also credit proxy advisory firms with improving corporate governance at companies. What is your view on that?
No, I think they have a role, but I think the role is exaggerated. A lot of people look at them as this great white hope for the investors. They are not. They do point out some things that are wrong in resolutions that are being brought. But look at the way it operates, and I'm sure people in this room know this. Their recommendations on resolutions that are going to the AGMs or the EGMs come a couple of days or maybe 3 days before the AGM or the EGM. When this goes to the companies who are shareholders and who have to vote on that, the people that have to vote based on the proxy advisory firm's recommendations do not apply their mind. They say the proxy firm has recommended, let's go ahead and vote on this basis. Why? Because if you want to disagree with what a proxy advisory firm has said, you have to then seek approval in your own company for why you're disagreeing. Much easier thing is to agree with what the proxy advisory firm says. So you have highly theoretical recommendations which are actually no good. See, these are matters where you got to look at the context in which a resolution is coming. You can't oppose because it doesn't meet some of your requirements. Somebody has 70% attendance, doesn't have 75%. You promptly say, no, you should vote against this guy. Look at the previous 3 years, does he have 100% the previous 3 years? There may be good reasons why he has 70% attendance, but there's no time to ask him that. I would not give them much importance, but boards need to look at what proxy advisory firms are saying, and companies that act on the recommendations need to apply their minds rather than outsource the thinking to the proxy advisory firms.
Do you think they are becoming a little bit too powerful and they need to be regulated?
In fact, in the United States, there is no regulation. I spoke to a professor in the US who had served briefly in the SEC, and I asked, what are the regulations? He said, no, we practice freedom of speech. Anyone can say whatever he wants. In India, SEBI has made an attempt to include them in the analyst regulations. It's not been 100% kind of a situation. They appointed a committee under Sandeep Parekh. There were some recommendations. Based on that, they've been included in the analyst regulations. Long way to go. But I think what's important is, for proxy advisory firms, some amount of self-regulation.
Would you like to elaborate on that? What exactly they can do?
I think what they need to do is to look at, themselves. What are they doing? Are they doing enough to justify their place in the ecosystem? And I'm putting it very bluntly. Now, we heard Anand said this, several others have said this also. Whatever you do, you must ensure that the ease of conducting business is not disrupted or obstructed. You do what you like to see it's conducted properly. Somewhere along the way, proxies need to ask themselves whether their regulations, while they may tick boxes, and all of them have principles on the basis of which they make the recommendations, how are they playing out in space? And then, are you giving enough of an opportunity to that company on whose resolutions you comment to respond? It's just 2 days' time, 3 days. By the time you send it, the recommendations have gone out to the investing companies.
On a related note, I wanted to ask you about shareholder activism. Yes. In the developed world, it is feared, but it is also celebrated and sometimes, most times, seen as a win-win for employees and shareholders. But in India, it is almost a taboo topic. We seem to abhor, shareholder activism and hostile takeovers. And do you agree with this view? We haven't seen many.
I think in India there have been, the cases have been few and far between, cases of shareholder activism by institutional shareholders, pushing back on some things that they did not like. Retail investors, unfortunately, cannot organize themselves. But we did a study on voting patterns over the last 5 years and discovered that there were, in some cases, a very interesting phenomenon where retail investors in large numbers voted against the resolution and institutions voted along with the management and got the resolution passed. We've seen instances of that also. But activism is good. We need activism. And we've seen, I'll take 2 minutes to explain to you one case that I was personally involved in the Unit Trust of India, and I'm talking about more than 20 years ago, where the proposal was to double the salary of the managing director of a company. The chairman was the father of the managing director. Family had significant shareholdings, but it was a listed entity. Company had done very badly. The sector had done very well. It was not a sectoral problem. It was a company-specific problem, and they wanted to double the salary. We as Unit Trust had 2% shareholding. We sent word that we will oppose the resolution. The chairman flew down here, he met me and he said, so you can oppose it if you want. You have 2%, the resolution will go through. I have spoken to other Indian institutional investors, they have agreed. I said, fair enough, you defeat us, we will vote. He said, then what will you do? I said, we'll release it to the papers on why we voted against this. That's all we will do. Your resolution will go through. He withdrew the resolution. So we've had instances off and on where an institution actually stood up and got counted in the process. Not enough. We need to do more of that. I would say this lastly, activism is good. What you see in the US on occasion is adventurism. We must draw that line. That's very clear. Yeah.
So on a related note, how do you view this whole Hindenburg episode? It's just 48 hours since they have shut shop.
Yes.
How do you view such companies and their interventions?
Well, I read that long message that he sent to people that had worked with him and his stakeholders. He said a lot of things there. But why did he say this now, not 3 months earlier or 6 months later? Was there a reason? We don't know. Nothing is coming out of that. That suddenly one fine day, is it that somebody gets into a business, makes money and says, I've had enough, too many headaches here, I'm leaving? Are there other pressures? We don't know. But there are people who say, and I saw one fairly well-regarded analyst who's made this statement, okay, short selling is not such a great thing. He might not have done short selling is not bad, but he might not have conducted himself well as a short seller. But some of his research findings you shouldn't just discard. Maybe you need to look at the research findings. So Gandhiji once said he got a letter full of abuse written in longhand. Gandhiji's time nobody used typewriters, I suspect, but written in longhand. And there were no staplers, so there was one pin which was tied to that. And Nehru was sitting in front of him. Nehru read it. Nehru was a fair complexion person. He turned beetroot red when he read this particular thing. And then he asked Gandhiji, so what are you going to do about this? Gandhiji patiently removed that pin. And those days we had those pin cushions with a lot of stuff in this. I can notice some of the senior people in the audience shaking heads. So Gandhiji removed the pin, put it in the pin cushion and threw the rest in the waste paper basket. And Nehru said, why did you do that? He said, I have extracted the only thing of value in that. Right? So maybe there is something in this report that you can extract, you can use, maybe not specific to the case that he covered, maybe the other issues you can look at. Look for what you can find which is valuable, junk the rest.
We have 3 minutes. Are you okay to take a couple of questions from the audience?
I'm happy to, yes.
Any questions from the audience? Get a mic across. Please raise your hand if you have a question.
Good evening, sir. Sneha from Mint. So you've been through the entire Satyam scam and, you were at the top of it. We're seeing that increasingly corporate governance, not just in public sector, publicly listed companies, but there are these unlisted companies where a lot of VC and PE investments have flown in. Ideally, one would expect that wherever institutional investors like PE and VC are there, corporate governance standards would be top notch. But we're seeing a lot of those companies, coming out with, whatever has been reported. So what is your view on that, and how can we improve corporate governance standards in these unlisted companies? Because they would eventually make it to the public markets.
First, a point of detail. The Satyam problem manifested itself good 10, 11 months after I left SEBI. So it was not on my watch that it blew up. It must have been actually cooking there, unnoticed by anybody, including analysts, including people like yourselves who look at the corporate sector. Nobody seemed to know what was happening. There seemed to have been a kind of a lid. Now, what went wrong there? What went wrong there was that the board of directors didn't ask the right questions. Those that were looking at the financial statements did not ask the questions. There was 7,000 odd crores reportedly sitting in the books, which money did not exist. Nobody asked, where is this money? What are you proposing to do with it? Because if an IT company has 7,000 crores, they'll either make an acquisition or at least give it to the guy in charge of treasury to make some money on that. Not make an entry there and let it lie around. The auditors didn't ask. Nobody asked these questions. So the failure was not a system. The failure was that some individuals took liberties with the system, thinking that they wouldn't get caught out. And when you look at the composition of the board, person for person, the Satyam board was among the best in India. You had people who were eminent scientists. There's a professor of corporate governance from Harvard. He continued to teach corporate governance after the Satyam problem also, but that's another matter. So the board did not, and what happened? You see, when you constitute a board, in any company, more than 50% of the problem is board composition. If a board is constituted well, many of your problems will be addressed automatically. So there is an expression in English literature on governance, which is flower vase directors, those that bring color to the boardroom but don't necessarily add value. In fact, long ago I had recommended that when you look at these people, go by the warning of the mutual fund industry. Don't look at their past lives, because past performance is no guarantee of future returns. That is something you need to look at when you induct people who in their previous lives have been great. And that was the problem there.
Thank you. One final question, because time's up. Who is better suited to head financial sector regulators? Who is better suited to head financial sector regulators, private sector leaders or government officials?
A good person. Let me elaborate. I'm not getting away just like that easily. You've had great regulators from the government sector. If you look at banking, for example, I will take a name. Dr. Venugopal Reddy was a government officer who went to the Reserve Bank as deputy governor, then became governor. I know some of the steps that he took were very unpopular with some people, and one editor of a newspaper described the Reserve Bank of India as the reverse Bank of India. They said things are going backwards. But when the crisis blew over, the international crisis, India was the last man standing, the rest had fallen by the wayside. Or maybe nearly the last man standing, because one governor decided, I am not seeking a popularity vote here, I am doing what I think is right. Came from the government sector. You had people from the private sector who've done equally well, right? So I don't think it's a question of where they come from, it's a question of why you're selecting a particular person. What attributes does that person bring? Is there a sense of balance? Is there a temperament that is suited to a regulatory position? Because some very great people might not be temperamentally suited. So you can't get people to... The best football players are not the best football referees. I mean, let me put it that way.
Thank you, Mr. Damodaran.